Some places were never meant to be understood. A stone covered in markings no one can fully read. A lake that breaks itself into perfect circles. A tower that still stands without modern design. And structures built around something hidden beneath the earth. These aren't myths. They're real locations. Real discoveries. Found, documented, and still not fully explained. In this video, we're not just looking at ruins. We're stepping into places where something doesn't quite fit. Where patterns appear without explanation. If that kind of mystery pulls you in, take a second to subscribe. It helps more than you think. And before we begin, comment below what time it is for you right now and where you're watching from. If you made it here, I hope things get easier for you. God bless you. Now, slow down. Stay with this. The long barrow that still holds its silence, West Kennet. It begins in a place that feels open, a wide stretch of land, rolling hills, soft slopes, nothing dramatic, nothing hidden at first glance, just landscape. But then, as you move across it, a shape begins to stand out, low, long, almost blending into the ground itself, not rising sharply, not demanding attention, but present, and that presence is deliberate. This is West Kennet Long Barrow. At first, it doesn't feel like a structure. It feels like part of the land, a natural rise, something formed over time. But the closer you get, the more that feeling changes, because the shape is too controlled, too even, too consistent, and that's when it becomes clear. This wasn't formed, it was made. The barrow stretches across the ground in a long, narrow form, not tall, but extended. Its length matters more than its height, because it was not meant to dominate the landscape. It was meant to exist within it, almost quietly, almost unnoticed. And yet, it has remained for thousands of years. That alone changes how you see it, because something this subtle has lasted longer than many things that were built to be seen. The entrance is not obvious from a distance. You have to approach, move closer, and then it appears, a small opening, set into the structure, framed by stone, leading inward, and that transition from open land to enclosed space is where everything shifts. Inside, the light changes, it softens, becomes limited, the air feels different, still, contained. The space narrows as you move forward, stone on either side, placed carefully, not random, not stacked loosely, but arranged, fitted together, creating a passage. And that passage leads deeper, not far, but far enough, because the purpose is not distance, it's enclosure. Chambers open from the central passage, small spaces, defined, not large, but intentional. And that's where the meaning begins to settle, because this is not just a structure, it's a place of placement, a place where something was left. The barrow is known to have been used for burials, human remains placed within these chambers, not once, but over time, repeatedly. And that repetition matters, because it means this place was not temporary. It was returned to, used again, recognized, remembered. Even as generations changed, even as time moved forward, the structure remained, and people came back to it, which means it held significance, not just as a burial site, but as a place, a location that mattered enough than to be used again and again. The construction itself required effort. Stone moved, earth shaped, all without modern tools, without machinery, and yet the result remains stable. The chambers still hold, the passage still stands, which suggests understanding, not just of building, but of balance, of weight, of how to create something that lasts. And that understanding is part of what makes it feel different, because this was not accidental. It was planned, measured, executed with intention. Still, there are no written records from the time it was built, no direct explanation, no clear statement of purpose from the people who made it, only the structure itself and what has been found within it, which means interpretation becomes necessary. Some see it as purely functional, a burial place, a way to store and honor the dead. Others see something more, a connection between life and death, a space designed to hold meaning, not just remains, but memory. And that idea fits with how the structure feels, because inside it is not empty, even when it is. There is a sense of presence, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just there. A quiet wait. A stillness that feels intentional. The barrow also aligns with the landscape in subtle ways, not sharply, not precisely in the way modern structures might, but enough to suggest awareness of the land, of position, of placement. Because where something is built can matter as much as how it is built. Even now the structure remains, partly restored, maintained, but still original in its form, still holding the shape it was given thousands of years ago. People walk into it, stand within it, observe it, but the full meaning remains uncertain, because without direct explanation, the purpose is never fully fixed. It stays open, not empty, but open to interpretation, and that openness is what keeps it alive, because something fully explained becomes history, but something not fully explained remains present. The land around it continues to change, seasons shift, light moves differently across it, but the barrow remains, unmoving, holding its form, holding its space, and whatever it was meant to hold has already been placed there, long ago, and that quiet, enduring structure, resting within the landscape. The tombs carved into the cliffs, Lycian rock tombs. It begins with a wall of stone, not built, not placed, but already there. A cliff face rising upward, shaped by time, wind, and pressure. Rough, uneven, the kind of surface that usually resists change. At first it feels untouched, natural, but then you notice something. Lines, edges, openings that don't belong to erosion, and suddenly the cliff is no longer just a cliff. It becomes something else. The Lycian rock tombs. At a distance they almost disappear into the stone, not because they are hidden, but because they were designed to match what was already there, carved directly into the rock, not added, not assembled, but removed, and that difference matters. Because building something requires materials, but carving something requires understanding, knowing what to take away, to reveal what should remain. The tombs are not random. They follow patterns, facades shaped like structures that could have been built on the ground, columns, doorways, frames, all carved into solid rock, and that creates a strange contrast, because what looks like architecture is not constructed. It is hollowed out. Inside, the spaces are simple, not large, not decorated in the way you might expect, but defined. Chambers cut into the stone, spaces meant to hold something, or someone. These were tombs, places of burial, but not placed underground, not hidden, raised high into the cliffs, and that placement changes how they feel, because height adds distance, not just physically, but symbolically. The tombs are not easily reached. They require effort, climbing, approach, which suggests intention. Because if something is difficult to access, it is not meant for constant interaction. It is meant to remain, undisturbed. The people who created these tombs did not leave direct explanations. No written records that clearly describe why they chose this method. Only the result remains, and that result suggests belief, because placing tombs high in rock faces is not the simplest option. It requires more effort, more planning, more precision, which means there was a reason. Some believe it was connected to the idea of elevation, that placing the dead higher brought them closer to something beyond the ground, not physically, but symbolically, a transition from one state to another. Others suggest protection. That height made the tombs less accessible, less likely to be disturbed, and that explanation is practical, because difficulty limits interaction. But even with that, there is still something more, because the design is not purely functional, it is detailed, carefully shaped, not just openings, but facades, structures carved to resemble something familiar, as if the tombs were meant to reflect life, even in death. And that idea changes how they are seen, because they are not just places of burial, they are representations of something that existed above ground, recreated within the stone. Even now the tombs remain, weathered, worn by time, but still recognizable, still holding their form. The cliff itself has changed. Erosion continues, edges soften, details fade, but the overall structure remains, because carving into rock creates durability, a resistance to change, even over long periods. Standing below them, the scale becomes clearer, not overwhelming, but elevated, distant, and that distance creates separation. Because these are not spaces you casually enter. They are observed, from below, from afar, and that perspective matters, because it keeps them removed, untouched, even as time passes, even as people come and go. The tombs remain part of the cliff, not separate from it, integrated, as if they belong there, even though they were created, and that blending is what makes them difficult to fully define, because they exist between categories, not purely natural, not entirely constructed, but something in between. And that space between is where the mystery settles, because without clear explanation, the meaning is never fixed. It remains open, subject to interpretation. Even now the tombs hold their silence, no movement, no change beyond what time allows, just presence, a series of openings in stone, placed higher than expected, designed with intention, but without explanation. And that quiet, elevated presence, the caves that were never meant to be empty, Valeron. It begins with a cliff that doesn't look unusual at first, just rock, rough, weathered, shaped by wind, heat and time, the kind of surface that doesn't invite attention. But then, as you get closer, the texture changes, not naturally, not randomly. You begin to notice openings, small, repeated, too consistent to ignore, and suddenly the cliff is no longer just stone. It becomes something else, the Valeron caves. From a distance they almost disappear into the rock, not because they are hidden, but because they were shaped to blend in. Hundreds of openings, carved into the cliff face, each one separate, each one defined, and that repetition creates a pattern, not decorative, not symbolic, functional, but not immediately understood. At first, it's easy to assume they were places of shelter, caves for living, spaces carved for protection. But the scale doesn't fully support that. The openings are too small, too uniform, too structured. They don't feel like rooms, they feel like compartments, and that difference matters, because compartments suggest storage, not habitation, not life, but placement. Something kept, something organised. Inside, the structure becomes clearer, a network of chambers, connected, layered, carved with intention, not randomly expanded, but planned. Each space positioned carefully, as if following a system, and that system suggests purpose, not temporary use, but repeated use, over time. Some believe these caves were used for storing grain, food, supplies, protected from heat, protected from moisture, and that explanation fits, because the cliff provides natural insulation, a stable environment, cooler than the surface, less exposed, and that would preserve what is stored inside. But even with that explanation, there are details that stand out. The scale, the number of compartments, the precision. Because this is not a small storage space. It is extensive, large enough to support a system, not just individual use, but collective, and that suggests something organised. Not random activity, but structured planning. Even the placement of the caves matters. High in the cliff, not easily accessible, not convenient, which means reaching them required effort, climbing, planning, intention, and that changes how they feel. Because if something is difficult to access, it is not meant for constant use. It is meant to be protected, stored carefully, kept safe. But safe from what? Environment, theft, time. There is no clear answer. Only the structure remains, and the structure suggests importance, because effort reflects value. The more effort something requires, the more it matters. Even now the caves remain, empty, but not empty in meaning, just empty in contents. Whatever was stored here has long been removed, taken, used, lost, but the spaces remain, unchanged, holding their form, holding their pattern, and that pattern is what stays, because it doesn't fade easily, carved into rock, protected by the cliff itself, resistant to time. Standing beneath it, the scale becomes more noticeable. Hundreds of openings, stacked, layered, each one part of something larger, and that larger system is what makes it compelling, because it suggests coordination, understanding, a way of organising space that goes beyond simple use. But without written records, the full purpose remains uncertain. We know what it could have been, but not exactly what it was. And that difference matters, because possibility is not confirmation. It leaves space. Space for interpretation, space for doubt, space for something more. The cliff remains, unchanged in its overall form, and within it, these openings continue, silent, unfilled, waiting without purpose, or perhaps still holding one. A structure carved not for display, not for visibility, but for function. And that quiet, repeated pattern in the stone, the ruins that don't fully reveal themselves, Kunduchi. It begins near the coast, not far from the ocean, a place where land and water meet in a way that feels constant, unchanged for longer than most things around it. The air carries salt, the ground feels dry in places, softer in others, and at first nothing suggests that anything unusual is there. Just open land, scattered vegetation, a quiet stretch that doesn't immediately draw attention. But then, as you move through it, you begin to notice shapes, not natural ones, not entirely, low structures, stone, partially buried, partially exposed, and that's when the landscape begins to shift. Because it's no longer just land, it becomes a site. The Kunduchi ruins. At first they don't feel like ruins in the way people expect. There are no towering walls, no large dramatic structures rising above the ground. Everything is subtle, lower, almost flattened by time, which makes them easy to overlook. But the more time you spend there, the more they begin to form something clearer. Foundations, walls that no longer stand fully upright, sections of stone arranged in ways that suggest rooms, boundaries, spaces that once had purpose. And that's where the first question appears. What was here? Because ruins are not just broken structures, they are remains of something that once functioned, something used, something lived in, or built for a reason. But here, the structure is incomplete, not just damaged, but missing context. There are no clear outlines of a city, no defined streets, no obvious centre, just fragments, pieces that don't immediately connect, and that makes it harder to understand. Because without a clear layout, the purpose becomes less certain. Some areas suggest habitation, spaces that could have been lived in. Others feel different, more open, less defined, as if they served another function. But without full structures, interpretation becomes uncertain. And that uncertainty is what defines the site. Because nothing here is fully explained, only suggested. The materials themselves are simple, stone, local, not shaped with extreme precision, but arranged carefully, enough to hold form, enough to last. And that suggests knowledge, not advanced in the way modern construction is, but effective, functional, designed to endure, even as everything else changed. The proximity to the coast also matters, because location is rarely random. Being near water suggests access, movement, trade, connection to something beyond the immediate area. And that adds another layer, because if this was a place connected to movement, then what we see now may only be part of it. The visible remains may not represent the full structure, only what was left behind, only what survived. Over time, the environment has altered the site, wind shifting sand, vegetation growing between stone, surfaces wearing down, edges softening, and that process continues, slowly, constantly, which means the ruins are not static. They are changing, even now, and that change affects how they are understood, because what is visible today may not have been visible before, and what was once visible may no longer be, which creates gaps in structure, gaps in interpretation, gaps in understanding. And those gaps are what make the site difficult to define, because without a complete picture, there is always something missing. Some believe the ruins represent a settlement, a place where people lived, built structures, created a system, and over time, that system faded, leaving only fragments. Others suggest it may have had a different purpose, not purely residential, but connected to something else, movement, storage, or even temporary use. But again, there is no confirmation, only possibility. Standing within the site, the feeling is quiet, Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just still. As if the space is holding something but not revealing it. Because nothing here tells a complete story. There are no inscriptions explaining its use, no clear markers defining its purpose, only structure and absence. The absence of what was once there, the absence of clarity, the absence of conclusion, and that absence is what defines it. Because without a clear explanation, the ruins remain open, not empty, but unresolved. Even now they continue to exist, partially buried, partially visible, holding their shape just enough to suggest something more, but not enough to fully explain it, and that balance between presence and absence is what makes them stay. Because something that is fully understood becomes part of the past, but something that is not fully understood remains present. The land continues around it, unchanged in its rhythm, waves moving beyond, wind crossing the ground, and within that movement, the ruins remain still, fragments of something that once existed, but no longer explains itself, and that quiet, incomplete presence. The stone structure that still holds its shape, Castello di Cucuruzzu. It begins in a landscape that feels older than it looks, not because of what is immediately visible, but because of how it sits. The ground is uneven, rocks scattered across the surface, vegetation growing between them, nothing arranged in a way that suggests intention. At first it feels natural, unstructured, but then, as you move further in, something begins to change. The stones are no longer scattered. They begin to gather, not randomly, not loosely, but in a way that feels placed, and that's when the structure appears, low at first, almost blending into the terrain, but defined, clear enough to separate itself from the land around it. This is Castello di Cucuruzzu. At a distance it doesn't stand out dramatically. There are no tall towers, no sharp edges rising above everything else. But as you get closer, the form becomes more noticeable. Walls, curving slightly, built from large stones, stacked without mortar, held together by weight, by placement, by understanding of balance. And that understanding is what makes it different. Because building without binding material requires precision. Each stone must fit, each piece must support the next. Otherwise it collapses, but this hasn't. It has remained, even as time has moved around it. The structure itself is compact, not expansive, not spread across a wide area, but contained, focused, as if everything was built within a defined space, and that creates a sense of enclosure, a boundary, not just physical, but intentional. Inside, the space feels controlled, not open, not empty, but held, as if it was designed to contain something, not necessarily objects, but activity, presence. The central area is slightly elevated, not dramatically, but enough to suggest importance, a focal point, and that detail matters, because structures often center around something, a purpose, a function, even if that function is no longer clear. Some believe this was a defensive structure, a place of protection, built to observe, to hold position, and that explanation fits in some ways, because the placement allows visibility, a view of the surrounding area, control over movement. But the scale feels different, not large enough for extended defense, not complex enough for a full system, which makes the interpretation uncertain. Others suggest it may have been residential, a place where people lived, but again, the space feels limited, contained in a way that doesn't fully support long-term habitation, and that leaves it in between, not clearly defensive, not clearly residential, something else, something that doesn't fit neatly into one category. The materials themselves offer few answers. Stone, local, unshaped in the modern sense, but selected, placed with care, and that selection suggests intention, because even without tools that create perfect shapes, choice still matters. Which stone to use, where to place it, how to align it, and those choices define the structure. Over time, parts of it have shifted, small collapses, edges softening, but the overall form remains, recognizable, stable enough to still be understood as a structure, even without full preservation. Standing within it, the feeling is different from outside, more enclosed, more still, as if the space holds something, even when it doesn't. and that feeling is difficult to define because it's not based on visible detail, it's based on presence. The way the structure shapes the space around it, the way it limits movement, guides perspective, and that guidance suggests design, not random placement, not accidental formation, but something planned, even if the plan is no longer clear. The surrounding landscape continues as it always has. Wind moves across it, light changes with time, shadows shift, but the structure remains, unmoving, holding its position, and that persistence matters, because it shows durability, not just physical, but conceptual, a structure that continues to exist, even without explanation, even without full understanding. And that lack of explanation is what keeps it present, because once something is fully understood, it becomes part of the past. But something that remains uncertain continues to exist in the present. The stones remain where they were placed, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to suggest purpose, enough to hold form, enough to raise questions, and that is what defines it. Not what it was, but what it still is. A structure that exists within the landscape, but does not fully explain itself, and that quiet, contained presence. The stone tower that still stands intact, Nuragelosa. It begins in a place that feels open, wide land, low vegetation, a horizon that stretches without interruption. Nothing dramatic at first, nothing that immediately demands attention. But then, a shape rises, not sharply, not suddenly, but enough to break the line of the land. A structure, stone, dark against the lighter ground. And that contrast is what draws you closer. This is Nuragelosa. From a distance, it feels solid, not just in appearance, but in presence. Compact, contained, built to hold itself together. As you approach, the form becomes clearer, circular, layered, constructed from large stones, stacked without mortar, each piece resting on another, held in place by weight and precision. And that precision matters, because without binding material, balance becomes everything. Every stone must fit, every angle must hold. Otherwise, the structure fails. But this hasn't. It has remained, not partially, not fragmented, but largely intact, even after thousands of years. And that changes how it feels, because most structures lose form over time. They collapse, they scatter. But this holds. The entrance is small, lower than expected, not designed for ease, not meant for open access. You step inside carefully, and the space shifts. Light reduces, sound changes, the air feels contained, and the structure reveals something more. Inside, the walls curve inward, not randomly, but gradually, each layer slightly angled, forming a chamber, not wide, but tall enough to feel enclosed, almost like a dome, and that shape is intentional, because it distributes weight, keeps the structure stable, allows it to hold without collapse, even under its own mass. The interior feels controlled, not empty, but defined, as if it was designed for a purpose beyond just standing. There are additional spaces, smaller chambers connected to the main one, passages that lead outward, not large, not open, but functional, suggesting movement, access, a system within the structure, and that system raises the question, what was this used for? Because it is not just a tower, not simply a structure built to stand. It contains space, it allows entry, it organizes movement, which means it had purpose. Some believe it was defensive, a place to observe, to protect, to hold position, and that explanation fits in some ways. The height provides visibility, the walls provide strength, the entrance limits access, but the interior feels different, more enclosed than open, more contained than expansive, which makes that explanation incomplete. Others suggest it was residential, a place where people lived, but the space feels too controlled, too limited for long-term habitation, which again creates uncertainty. It exists between definitions, not fully one thing, not fully another, and that is what keeps the question open, because without clear evidence, purpose becomes interpretation. The construction itself remains the most defining feature. Large stones, carefully placed, fitted without cutting into perfect shapes, yet still forming a stable structure, and that suggests knowledge, not modern, but effective. an understanding of how weight behaves, how structure holds, how to build something that lasts. Over time, the exterior has changed slightly, edges have softened, surfaces worn, but the overall form remains, recognizable, stable, unmoved, even as everything around it shifts. Standing outside again, the structure feels different. Not just a building, but a presence, something that holds space, something that defines its surroundings, even without activity, even without explanation. The land continues around it, wind moves across it, light changes with time, but the tower remains, still, unchanging in its form. And that stillness is what makes it stand out, because movement fades, but stability remains, and this has remained, not perfectly preserved, but intact enough to hold its meaning, even if that meaning is not fully known, and that is what defines it, not what it was used for, but what it continues to be, a structure that stands without fully explaining itself, and that quiet, enduring presence. The hill that was shaped to be held, Dunadir. It begins with a rise in the land, not steep, not dramatic, just a hill, grass covering its surface, wind moving across it without resistance. At first, it feels natural, like any other elevation in the landscape, something shaped slowly over time, but then, as you move upward, something changes. The ground begins to feel structured, not obviously, not in a way that immediately stands out, but in subtle lines, edges that don't follow the natural slope. And that's when the hill stops being just a hill. This is Dunadir. From a distance it blends into everything around it. Nothing rises sharply, nothing interrupts the horizon. But closer, the form becomes clearer. Terraces, layers cut into the slope, not perfectly straight, but controlled. As if the land itself has been shaped, and that idea shifts everything. Because shaping a hill is different from building on it. It requires altering what already exists, removing, rearranging, creating levels where there were none. And that takes effort, time, planning, which means this was not accidental. The hill was changed, not completely, but enough to create structure within it. As you continue upward, the shape becomes more defined, circular, not perfectly, but clearly following a boundary, a form that encloses, contains, and that creates a sense of space, not open, but held. At the top, the structure becomes more visible, remains of stone, low, fragmented, but present, enough to suggest something stood here, something built. And that raises the next question. What was placed at the highest point? Because elevation matters, it provides visibility, control, awareness of everything below, and that suggests purpose. Some believe this was a defensive site, a hill fort, a place to observe, to protect, to hold position. And that explanation fits, because the location allows it, the structure supports it, the elevation reinforces it, but even with that, there is more. Because the shaping of the hill goes beyond simple defense, the terraces, the layering. They feel deliberate in a way that suggests planning beyond function, almost as if the land itself was part of the design, not just a base, but a component, and that changes how it is understood. Because now the structure is not just built on the hill, it is part of it, integrated, blended into the terrain, and that integration makes it harder to separate. Where does the natural end and the constructed begin? There is no clear line, only a gradual transition, and that uncertainty is what defines it. Even now, the structure is incomplete, not fully preserved, not entirely visible, just fragments. But those fragments are enough to suggest what once existed, even if they don't fully explain it. Standing at the top, the view is wide, open, unobstructed. Everything below becomes visible, and that perspective matters, because it reinforces purpose. Position was not random, it was chosen, for a reason, even if that reason is not fully known. The stones that remain are worn, shifted slightly over time, edges softened, but still holding their place, still marking where something stood. And that persistence is important, because it shows continuity, even in absence, even without full structure. The shape remains, the form is still there, And that is enough to hold the idea, enough to keep the question alive. The hill itself continues to exist as it always has. Wind passes over it, seasons change it, grass grows and fades, but the underlying shape does not disappear, because once the land is shaped, it stays that way. Even if the details fade, even if the structures above it are lost, the form remains, and that form carries meaning, even without explanation, even without confirmation. It exists, present, unresolved, and that is what makes it different, because it is not just a structure. It is a place where the land itself was changed, a hill that was shaped to become something more, and that quiet transformation, the stone rings that still hold their boundary, Rathgall. It begins with a rise in the land, not steep, not dramatic, just a hill, covered in grass, open to the sky. At first, it feels like nothing more than part of the landscape, something shaped slowly over time, unchanged. But as you move closer, something begins to appear, not all at once, not clearly, just lines, curves, subtle changes in the ground, and then the pattern becomes visible, circles, not one, but many, layered, wrapped around each other. And that's when the hill becomes something else. This is Rathgall. From a distance it blends into the surroundings. Nothing rises sharply, nothing demands attention, but up close, the structure reveals itself. Stone walls, low, wide, forming rings, each one enclosing space within it, and that enclosure changes how it feels, because this is not open land. It is defined, divided, organized. The outer ring is the largest, broad, encircling the hill, not perfectly smooth, but consistent, as if it was placed to mark a boundary, not just physical, but intentional, and that boundary matters because it separates, inside from outside, one space from another, and as you move inward, the rings continue, smaller, more contained, each layer bringing you closer to the center, and that layering creates progression, not just movement, but transition. Because each step inward changes the space, the feeling becomes more enclosed, more controlled, as if the structure is guiding you, not forcing direction, but shaping it. At the center, the space is different, more open, yet more defined, because everything leads here. All rings, all boundaries, all paths, and that suggests importance, because central spaces are rarely random. They are chosen, designed, given meaning. Some believe this was a defensive structure, a hill fort, a place to protect, to observe, to control movement, and that explanation fits in part. Because the elevation allows visibility, the rings create barriers, the layout supports defense. But there is something more, because the structure is not just practical, it is deliberate in a different way. The rings are not irregular, they follow form, they repeat, and repetition suggests pattern, not just function, but design. And that design raises another question. Was this only for defense, or something else as well? Some interpretations suggest gathering, a place where people came together, not just to protect, but to meet, to organize, to perform activities that required space and structure. And that idea changes how it feels, because now the rings are not just barriers, they are divisions, spaces within spaces, each with its own purpose, but without clear records. The full meaning remains uncertain. There are no inscriptions, no direct explanations, only the structure itself, and what it suggests. The stones are large, placed carefully, not shaped into perfect forms, but fitted, held together by weight and position, and that method creates stability, even over time, even as conditions change. Parts of the structure have shifted, some stones moved, some sections reduced, but the overall pattern remains. The rings are still visible, still defining the space, and that persistence is important, because it shows that the design holds, even when details fade. Standing within it, the experience changes. The outside world becomes less present, not because it disappears, but because the boundaries define focus. Each ring creates distance between where you are and where you were, and that creates separation, not complete, but enough to feel. And that feeling is difficult to define, because it is not based on what is seen alone. It is based on how the space behaves, how it contains, how it guides. And that suggests intention beyond simple construction. Even now, Rathgall remains open, accessible, but still structured, still holding its form. The land around it continues as it always has. Wind moves across it, seasons change it, light shifts across the stones. But the rings remain, unbroken in their pattern, unchanged in their purpose, even if that purpose is not fully known, and that is what defines it, not what it was, but what it continues to be, a space divided into layers, each holding meaning, even without explanation. And that quiet circular structure, the structure built around what lies beneath, Motilla de l'Azur. It begins in a landscape that feels dry, flat, open, a place where water is not obvious, not visible on the surface, not part of the environment in a way that stands out. And that absence matters, because in places like this, water defines everything, where people stay, where they move, where they build. But here, there is no visible source, at least not at first. Then, rising from the ground, a shape appears, low, circular, constructed, not natural, and that's when the land begins to change. This is Motilla de l'Azur. From a distance it doesn't seem large, not towering, not dominant, but as you move closer, the structure becomes clearer. Walls, thick, layered, built from stone, encircling a central space. And that enclosure is immediate, because it is not open, it is contained, defined, and that definition suggests purpose, not temporary, not accidental, but planned. The outer walls form a boundary, strong, stable, designed to hold, but not just to protect from outside, to hold something within. And that shifts the question. Because now, it's not just about what the structure is, but what it surrounds. Inside, the space narrows. Walls continue inward, creating layers, not just one boundary, but multiple, each one guiding movement, each one controlling access, and that creates depth, not just physically, but functionally. Because to reach the center, you must pass through layers, through design, through intention, and at the core, there is something unexpected, a well, deep, cut into the ground, reaching below the surface, to where water exists, even when it cannot be seen. And that changes everything, because now the structure makes sense. It is not just a building, it is a system, a way of accessing something hidden, something essential. Water. In a place where water is not visible, this becomes more than useful. It becomes necessary. The depth of the well suggests effort, not simple digging, but sustained work, understanding of the ground, of where water can be found, and how to reach it. And that knowledge matters, because without it, the structure would have no purpose. But with it, everything aligns. The walls protect the well, the layers control access. The entire structure is built around one thing, what lies beneath. Some believe this was purely functional, a water system, a way to ensure survival, and that explanation is strong. Because water defines settlement. It determines where people can stay, how long they can remain. But there is more. Because the structure is not minimal. It is not just a well. It is a fortified space, built with attention, with effort beyond what is strictly necessary. And that suggests importance beyond function. Because when something is built with that level of care, it means it mattered, not just as a resource, but as a place, a central point, a focus, perhaps even something shared, not owned by one, but used by many. And that creates another layer, because shared resources require structure, control, organization, and this provides that. Even now, the structure remains. The walls still stand, the form still holds, the well still exists at the center, and that persistence is important, because it shows that the design worked, not temporarily, but over time. The environment around it continues to shift, dry conditions, changing seasons, but the structure remains stable because it was built with understanding of the land, of the need, of what had to be preserved. Standing within it, the feeling is different, more enclosed, more focused, because everything leads inward, toward the center, toward what lies below. And that direction is not accidental. It is intentional. The entire structure guides you, not outward, but inward, towards something unseen, but essential, and that creates a quiet realization. Because this is not just a ruin, not just a structure left behind. It is a response to environment, to necessity, to survival, and that makes it more than architecture. It becomes adaptation. Even without full records, the purpose becomes clearer, not completely defined, but understood enough. The stones remain where they were placed. The walls still form their rings. The centre still holds its depth. And that is enough. Enough to understand what mattered, even if every detail is not known. And that quiet structure, built not just above the ground, but around what lies beneath it. A stone that doesn't belong here, Okotoks erratic. It begins with something that feels out of place, not hidden, not buried, but visible, resting on open land, a single, massive stone, surrounded by nothing like it. And that's what makes it noticeable, because the land around it is consistent. Grass, soil, flat in places, gently rising in others, but nothing that matches the stone. No similar formations, no matching material nearby, just one. And that's enough to raise the question. This is the Okotoks erratic. From a distance, it looks almost natural, like it belongs, but the closer you get, the more that feeling changes. The size becomes clear, large, heavy, too large to be easily moved, too solid to be explained by simple placement, and the material itself is different, not matching the ground beneath it, not matching the surrounding landscape, which means it came from somewhere else, and that creates the first real question. How did it get here? Because stones like this do not move on their own. They don't travel across land. They don't relocate without force, and this is not a small object. It is massive, weighing more than what would be practical to move, without modern methods. But this was not moved recently. It has been here for a long time, long enough to become part of the landscape, even though it doesn't belong to it. The most accepted explanation involves ice, not surface ice, but glaciers, massive sheets of ice that once covered large areas of land, moving slowly, carrying material with them, stones, rock, everything in their path, and over time, transporting it across distances until the ice melts and what it carried is left behind. And that explains a lot, because glaciers are powerful, capable of moving objects far larger than this, across terrain, over long periods, and when they recede, they leave behind what they carried. Ratics, objects that don't match their surroundings. But even with that explanation, there is still something that feels different, because the distance matters. Where this stone originated is far from where it now rests, not just nearby, but far enough to make the journey significant, and that adds weight to the idea. Because movement at that scale is not immediate. It takes time, thousands of years, gradual, almost unnoticeable in the moment, but massive in effect. And that changes how the stone is understood, because it is not just a rock, it is evidence of movement, of change, of a landscape that was once very different. The surface of the stone shows that time, worn, textured, not smooth, not untouched, but shaped by exposure, weather, conditions that have acted on it since it arrived, and that suggests stability, because once it reached this place, it stayed. Not moved again, not shifted significantly, just present. Even now, it remains exactly where it was left, not anchored, not fixed by design, but too large to be easily disturbed, too heavy to be moved by natural forces that exist today. And that creates a contrast, because the force that brought it here no longer exists in the same way. The glaciers are gone, the landscape has changed, but the stone remains, a reminder of what once was. Standing near it, the scale becomes more apparent, not just in size, but in presence, because it dominates its immediate space, not by height, but by difference. Everything around it is uniform, consistent, and this is not. It breaks the pattern. And that is what draws attention, because patterns define expectation, and anything that breaks them creates questions, even without mystery, even with explanation. There is still something about it. Because knowing how something happened does not always remove the impact of seeing it. The contrast remains, the difference remains, and that difference is enough. Even now, the stone continues to sit there, unchanged, unaffected by the absence of the force that moved it. Part of the landscape, but not from it. And that distinction is what defines it. Not what it is made of, not just how it got there, but the fact that it doesn't belong, yet remains, and that quiet, unmoving presence in a place where it shouldn't be. The lake that breaks into patterns, Spotted Lake. It begins with something that doesn't look like a lake. Not at first. From a distance, the surface doesn't reflect like water should. It doesn't move in the same way. It doesn't hold a single shape. Instead, it appears divided, separated into forms that feel almost designed, and that's where the first sense of difference begins, because lakes are expected to be continuous, open, connected, but this one is not. This is Spotted Lake. At first glance, it feels still, quiet, almost unmoving. But as you get closer, the pattern becomes clearer. Circular shapes, repeated, separated by thin ridges, each one holding its own section of water, and that changes how it is seen. Because this is not one surface, it is many, contained, defined, almost like separate pools within a single place. And that structure feels unusual, because water does not usually divide itself this way. Not naturally, not so clearly, but here it does. The explanation begins with minerals. The lake contains high concentrations of them, different types, each affecting the water in its own way. As temperatures rise, water begins to evaporate, slowly, gradually, and as it does, what remains becomes more concentrated. The minerals separate, crystallize, form boundaries, creating shapes, distinct, repeated, and that explains the pattern, but explanation doesn't remove the effect, because even when understood, it still feels unusual. Each pool has a different colour, not dramatically different, but enough to notice, subtle shifts, from one circle to another, and that variation comes from composition. Different minerals, different concentrations, changing how light interacts with the surface, and that creates visual difference, but also reinforces separation. Because each section feels individual, not just part of a whole. Standing near it, the surface appears still, almost unmoving, because the water is shallow, contained. And that stillness adds to the feeling, because movement often defines water. But here, there is very little, only form, only pattern, and that pattern remains, even as conditions change, because the process repeats, season after season. Water rises, water recedes, minerals concentrate, shapes form, then shift again, but always return. Not exactly the same, but recognizable, and that repetition is important, because it shows consistency, not random occurrence, but a cycle, a process that continues, even without intervention. But beyond the physical explanation, there is something else, meaning, because this is not just a natural sight, it is also a place of significance, recognized, respected, held with importance beyond what is visible, and that changes how it is approached, because it is not just observed, it is understood as something more, not in terms of mystery, but in terms of value, a place that carries presence, even without movement, even without sound, and that presence is quiet, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just there, consistent, like the pattern itself. Even now, the lake continues to form its shapes, not forced, not controlled, just following the conditions that define it. Temperature, evaporation, mineral composition, all working together, creating something that appears structured, without being constructed. And that distinction matters, because nothing here was placed by hand, nothing was arranged intentionally. And yet, the result feels intentional, ordered, defined. And that is what makes it compelling, because it sits between understanding and perception. We know how it forms, but it still feels unusual. The land around it remains unchanged, dry, open, holding the lake within it, but not affecting its pattern, because the process is internal, driven by what is within the water itself, not by what surrounds it, and that creates separation between the lake and everything else. Even now it continues, forming, dividing, holding its shapes, each section distinct, each part connected, a surface that is not continuous, but still one, and that contradiction is what defines it, because it shows that something can be unified, while still divided, natural, while appearing structured, understood, yet still unusual, and that quiet, patterned surface, the stone covered in marks that no one fully reads, Dighton Rock. It begins with something that doesn't look important at first, just a rock, large, resting near the water, worn by time, nothing unusual in shape, nothing that immediately suggests meaning, but then you look closer, and the surface changes, not physically, but in how it is seen. Lines begin to appear, not random scratches, not natural cracks, but markings, carved, placed, repeated. And that's when the rock becomes something else. This is Dighton Rock. At first, the carvings don't form a clear image. They overlap, intersect, some deeper, some faint, and that makes them difficult to read, because there is no single pattern that stands out immediately, no obvious starting point, no clear direction, just marks, covering the surface. And that creates the first question: what do they represent? Because carvings are rarely random. They require effort, time, tools, which means they are made with purpose. But here, the purpose is not clear. Some shapes resemble figures, others look like symbols, some suggest movement, others remain still, and that variation makes interpretation difficult, because there is no single explanation that fits everything. Over time, many interpretations have been suggested. Different ideas, different meanings, each trying to make sense of the patterns. Some see language, a form of communication, a message carved into stone. Others see representation, scenes, events, moments captured in form, and some see something else entirely, not a message, but a collection. Marks added over time, by different people, for different reasons. And that idea changes everything, because if the carvings were not made at once, then they are not one message. They are many, layered, combined. And that would explain the complexity, the overlap, the lack of a single clear pattern. Because each addition changes what came before, alters the surface, adds new meaning, or removes clarity. And that makes the rock difficult to read, not because it has no meaning, but because it has too much, too many possibilities, too many layers. The location also matters, near water, a place where movement happens, where people pass, where interaction occurs, and that suggests visibility, because carving something here means it was meant to be seen, not hidden, not buried, but present, available, even if not fully understood. The surface of the rock has changed over time, weather, water, exposure, all affecting the carvings, softening lines, fading details, altering depth, and that adds another layer of difficulty. Because what we see now may not be exactly what was made. Details may be lost, shapes may be altered, which means interpretation becomes even more uncertain. Even now the carvings remain, visible, but not fully readable, because reading requires understanding, and understanding requires context, which is limited. There are no direct records explaining them, no clear reference point, only the markings themselves, and what they suggest. Standing near the rock, the scale becomes more apparent, not just in size, but in density, because the surface is filled, not empty, not spaced out, but covered, as if every available area was used, and that suggests importance, because effort reflects value. Time spent carving something means it mattered, even if the reason is no longer clear. Some believe the rock was a place of communication, a way to leave marks, to record presence, to share something. But without knowing the system, the message remains incomplete. Others believe it may not have been meant to be read in the way we expect, not language, but expression, a form of marking that holds meaning for those who created it, but not necessarily for others. And that idea shifts the focus, because now the question is not what does it say, but what did it mean to those who made it? And that is harder to answer. Because meaning does not always translate, it does not always carry forward, it remains tied to its origin. Even now the rock continues to exist, unchanged in its position, still holding the markings, still presenting the same surface, but the interpretation remains open, not fixed, not confirmed, just explored. And that is what keeps it present, because something that cannot be fully read, cannot be fully closed, it remains active, not in movement, but in thought, in interpretation, in the attempt to understand. The water nearby continues to move, the environment continues to change, but the rock remains, holding its markings, holding its surface, and whatever was placed there remains with it. Even if the meaning is not fully known, even if the message is not fully understood, and that quiet carved surface, filled with marks that resist clear explanation,